Why is it that my timing never seems to line up with God's timing? Do you ever ask yourself that question? You ever thought through that? You see, it can be so hard to wait for God. It can be so hard when you're in the middle of trying to pray through something and you're trying to get an answer. It can be even harder if you feel like you've already heard from God and you're just waiting on it to happen. You see, there's this tension that we live in during this season of waiting in our lives, isn't there? Because we balance at the beginning this hopefulness, this faithfulness, this trust in God, but it seems like the longer we have to wait, the harder that gets, and the more opportunities that doubt starts to creep in. Maybe frustration, maybe you get irritated, maybe you just get mad with God because it hasn't happened yet. Today, that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to talk about what we can do while we're waiting on God. I'm Steve, lead pastor of Everrise Church, and you're watching Rising, our weekly running devotional series where we talk about things going on in the culture, we talk about the Bible, and how we can apply it to our everyday lives. Stay tuned. Seriously, I want you to think about this for a second. How long do you typically find yourself waiting for an answer or waiting for God to move or do something before you start to have those first feelings of doubt and frustration? You know, I think maybe sometimes, depending on what it is, that time frame might look a little bit different, but I would say generally, just looking at my life and, just kind of the people that I know, and probably a few weeks is a good time frame to where we're still really hopeful and things like that. But as we start getting into that month time frame, those couple months time frame, I feel like we all probably have a tendency to begin getting frustrated. Today, we're going to look at a story of a young man who had to wait over 20 years before what God had promised him came to fulfillment. Over 20 years. And so, as we look at this story, I want us to just see the way that he acted and reacted to the things going on in his life. And I think there's some things from that we can pull out and begin to apply in our own lives as we find ourselves in those waiting moments throughout our lives. You see, the young man I'm talking about goes by the name of Joseph. Now, we're going to do a little bit of Bible history here for a second. So we're going to go all the way back to Abraham, right? Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob and Esau. And then Jacob had some sons, and eventually he had a son named Joseph. Now, if you've ever been to Sunday school as a kid or ever been to any church programs, then Joseph would be the one that gets the coat of many colors. He'd be the one that was the favorite of his father, and that found favor in his father's eyes. But Joseph didn't really have the greatest of circumstances and things happen to him, especially as he got older. You see, when he was about 17, Joseph had a couple dreams actually, and he shared these dreams with his family. And basically, long story short, the dreams were basically saying that the rest of his family was one day going to be bowing down in submission to him. And if you got brothers or sisters, you can imagine that the older ones probably did not care hearing for that very much. And that's exactly what we see play out. You see, as a result of that, Joseph's brothers really begin to hate him and dislike him a lot. And so when Joseph goes to check on him one day, they come up with this plan. And at first they were actually going to try to kill Joseph, but then they decided that was going to be too much to try to deal with. So what they did instead is they stripped him of his special coat, they threw him in a well, and they left him there. Well, as he's sitting in this well, there was this caravan of merchants that was coming by. And these brothers thought to themselves, and they were like, you know what? Killing him isn't going to gain us anything. If we're going to do something, we might as well at least profit from it, right? And so they actually sell their younger brother to these merchants as a slave. And so here you got Joseph doing nothing wrong, doing just what his father asked him to do, to go check on his brothers in the field, make sure they were doing okay. And this is after the dream he had gotten from God that revealed to him that one day his family would bow down to him. And now all of a sudden, he finds himself sold into slavery. Not a good situation. And we don't ever see this, but I don't know. I have to wonder. I wonder what was going through Joseph's brain as he was literally being sold into slavery by his brothers. I wonder if he was doubting. I wonder if he was like, Lord, these people are supposed to be bowing down to me one day, and now I'm literally being sold as a slave. Like, I don't know, but we don't really see that from Joseph. We really don't see these moments of doubt in his life, because as the story continues, like I said, this was about when he was 17. He goes and he ends up in this official's house named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar lived in Egypt, and he was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. And so he was a very wealthy, very influential man. Well, while Joseph finds himself in this man's household as a slave, the Bible actually tells us that God was with him and God's favor was upon him, if you can believe it or not. And so Potiphar noticed that everything that Joseph did, everything that he touched, everything that he was in charge of was blessed. And so Potiphar very quickly made Joseph the head of his entire household. In fact, Joseph pretty much ran everything in Potiphar's household for him. And that was because God was with him. And so while Joseph has gotten this favor from God and gotten this favor from his master, something else happens to him. You see, the Bible also tells us that Joseph was a very handsome man, very attractive. And Potiphar's wife soon took notice of that. And so she began to try to do these things to entice Joseph to sleep with her. And Joseph actually responds to her, and he's like, how could I do that against my master? And then he says, how could I do this sin against God? So even though Joseph had been sold into slavery, abandoned by his brothers, just dejected and rejected by his family, now he finds himself as a slave. Even in that moment, he was still remaining faithful and true to God. And so they were in the house alone one day. She literally grabs him by the coat, and she tries to force him to sleep with her. And so he ends up running out of the house. And in the process of doing that, he leaves his coat there. And so she takes his coat. She comes up with this elaborate lie, this story about how Joseph tried to come in and rape her, and she screamed, and then he ran away and just forgot his coat and all the fuss. And so Potiphar gets home. She tells him this. And so obviously he's very mad. He's very raged. And he ends up taking Joseph, and he ends up throwing him in prison. So now you've got Joseph, again, not having done anything wrong. And from what we can see, still trusting God, still following God, sold into slavery, and now he's thrown into prison, having done nothing wrong. And now he's sitting there in prison, and the Bible again tells us that he meets these two other gentlemen that are in there with him. One was the chief cupbearer, and one was the bread maker for Pharaoh. And so they end up having dreams, and Joseph is like, well, the interpretation of dreams belongs to God. Why don't you share those with me, and we'll ask God, and we'll see what they mean, right? And so anyway, they share their dreams with him. Joseph interprets them, and it turns out to be true. Everything that Joseph interpreted came out to be completely true. And so the one thing that Joseph had asked was that once these people got out of prison, that if they would remember him and speak a kind word to Pharaoh for him, so that he might be able to get out too. Well, they forget about him. Well, the bread baker dies, because that's what happened through the dream, and Joseph interpreted that. But the cupbearer lives, and he completely forgets about Joseph. The Bible actually tells us that it's 2 years from the time that the guy got out of prison to when he actually remembered who Joseph was, because after 2 years, Pharaoh ended up having a dream, a couple of dreams, and it really concerned him. He was really bothered by them, and no one was able to interpret them and tell him what they meant. And then all of a sudden, after 2 years, the cupbearer was like, "Yeah, my bad. I actually know a guy that might be able to help us." And so Pharaoh calls for Joseph, gets him out of prison. Joseph appears before Pharaoh. He shares his dreams, and Joseph interprets what his dreams mean. And basically, he tells Pharaoh, "Look, there's going to be 7 really good years, and then there's going to be 7 really bad years. We're going to have a famine. People aren't going to have much. And so, what we need to do is we need to try to take these good years, and we need to start saving some, putting it aside, so that we'll be prepared for when the 7 bad years come." And so Pharaoh hears this. He's excited. He thinks it's a great idea. So he actually takes Joseph and he makes him the second in command over all of Egypt. And again, the Bible says that Pharaoh said, "Only matters concerning the throne will you not have authority." And so Joseph finds himself being raised to the number 2 position over the entire country of Egypt. And then we have the 7 good years, then the 7 bad years hit. And then lo and behold, wouldn't you know, Joseph's family shows up because they need help. They had run out of food. They didn't have enough grain and things like that back in their home country. And so they came to Egypt because they had heard that Egypt had had a surplus because they had been preparing. But I just want to let y'all in on the time frame here. So Joseph was 17 when he got this dream from God that was basically telling him that his family would one day be bowing down to him. He was 17. He was 30 by the time that he ended up going through slavery, going through prison, and then being brought out of that to where he was set up as the number 2 person in all of the land. So it was 13 years from the time that he had the dream to where he was in a position to where things were actually kind of looking good for him for once. And then it was at least another 7 years going through the good period. So all in all, we're looking at over 20 years that Joseph had to wait for what God had promised him to be fulfilled. And eventually we see that comes to pass. Joseph's family, he is reconciled with them. They literally bow down to him because he holds their life in his hands as the number 2 guy in Egypt and the one that's able to give them food and help them to survive. And so we do see ultimately that God was faithful, that God was true to his promise. But could you imagine waiting 22 years for something that God promised you before it actually happened? I don't know. Like, I just look in my own life and that'd be a long time to wait. And I don't know if I would be as happy and as faithful as Joseph was. But as we look and evaluate Joseph's life and the way he reacted, there are some things that we can pull out of that as we begin to think about some of the things that we can do when we find ourselves in these waiting periods. First and foremost, and you may not like this answer, it might be hard to swallow, but first and foremost, you just have to continue to have faith and trust. I know. Trust me, I get it. Way easier said than done. Believe me. I've gone through my fair share of waiting and doubts and frustrations. But if there's one thing that we know to be true about God, it's that he is good, he is faithful, and he keeps his promises. And the Bible tells us that he works all things for good to those who love him, right? And so while we're in these waiting periods, we have to remember these truths about God. We have to look at some of these stories like Joseph that can encourage us and help us, and we have to remain faithful. We must never give up hope. We must continue to trust that God is going to be who he's going to be and that he's going to do what he promises he's going to do. I also think another thing that we can do when we find ourselves in these waiting periods is to continue to do the things that we know we need to do. And again, I know that can be hard to hear, and it's a lot easier to say than it is to put into practice. But while we're waiting on that direction, while we're waiting on that door to open up for us, or while we're waiting for that miracle to happen or that breakthrough to happen, or we're waiting for that person that we've been praying for God to really have an impact in their life and see them come to faith. Like, while we're waiting, we know that there are certain things that we need to do as Christians. There are certain things that should just be characteristics of our life, right? Even in this waiting period, that's joy. We need to continue to exhibit joy. Like when I just think about the fruits of the Spirit, love, we got to show love to people. Joy, peace, we got to have this peace in our lives, even in the struggle and the chaos and the waiting. Patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Like these should be characteristic of our lives, even in these hard times, even in these waiting periods, right? We don't necessarily need to just get frustrated and be snappy and then cut people out and then just kind of give up. Like that's not something that's going to help us. That's not really going to get us where we want to be. And so we might not necessarily know what the next step is. We might not know when God is going to do what we feel like he's told us he's going to do. But we do know the things that God wants from us and expects from us all the time, every day, and especially in those waiting periods. And so we know that we need to continue to pursue him. We need to continue to spend that time where we spend in prayer, where we read through his Bible. We allow him to encourage us in that waiting period. We need to treat people with love and respect and kindness and grace and mercy and all these things, right? And so if we're doing those things, then that's part of this waiting process. And I'm just going to be honest with you, as I look back in my own life and I see the different areas and things where God has moved and he's done things, oftentimes it's through those waiting periods and those almost frustrating times where I look back and I see that I've grown the most and I see that I've matured the most. And after having gone through some of those times, it's helped shift my perspective. It's helped encourage me. And so when I find myself getting into these periods of waiting now, I feel like I'm a lot more equipped to be able to do that. So that's kind of the third thing, is just know that ultimately God is going to use this time, this season of waiting in your life, and all he's going to do is just make you stronger. It's going to allow you to understand him and know him in a new and a different way. It'll strengthen your relationship with him. It'll strengthen the faith that you have in him, especially if you've been waiting for a long time and that thing finally gets here, that thing finally happens, right? It brings that validation, that confirmation that, okay, I'm not crazy. God is God and he is good, right? And so, and I think we see all of this throughout the story of Joseph, right? He didn't give up hope. He didn't abandon God. He didn't turn away and just start living a crazy life. He continued to do what he needed to do. And ultimately, because of what he went through, it equipped him and allowed him to be in a position to where God could use him when he needed him. So for anybody that's sitting there going through waiting periods right now, I understand this might not be the end all be all to your problems, and it might not answer every question that you have, but I do hope that maybe this sheds just a little bit of light on your situation, that maybe it brings you a little bit of comfort, a little bit of peace, a little bit of joy, knowing that when we look at the story of Joseph, he had to wait over 20 years, but God was faithful, God was true, and it happened. And I hope that we can look back at these periods and these times in our own lives as we've been waiting, and we can be proud of the way we've handled it, that we don't have shame, that we don't have these regrets because we gave up hope, we turned our back on God, or we got frustrated, right? I want us to be able to look back and be like, you know what, even in the toughest times, I was able to stay strong. I was able to keep my faith in God and my trust in him, and ultimately it played out. It paid off, and I'm stronger and I'm better for it. So if that's you, I just want you to be encouraged as you watch through this. And if you want to talk to somebody, if you just need to vent some frustrations, if you've got questions, please feel free to reach out. Feel free to connect. I'd love to just help you go through whatever it is that you find yourself waiting on in this season of your life. But y'all, again, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate all those who support this channel, who support this this devotional series. It means a lot, and we do hope that you continue to find joy and strength and encouragement as we continue to put these out. Until next week, God bless.